Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
I got a male down in Middle Street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Hey, good evening. Thanks for joining me tonight. Project Cold Case's weekly Facebook Live. I'm the founder and executive director of Project Cold Case, Ryan Backman. Joining you back from the office in downtown Jacksonville, Florida. Appreciate your time tonight and your attention as we do some more Q&A. These seem to be popular. Lots of people have questions about cold cases. We like to answer them the best we can. We've got a lot of experience now and with investigators, with law enforcement agencies, and with families. And we use that knowledge that we have gained to educate the general public and help out as much as we can. Appreciate Chad checking in today and Jem. Appreciate you guys watching. He's kind of posted today that start off with just some general questions. I know if some people watch this regularly, then you may hear some things that are repetitive. But one of the things that we've noticed is that, a lot of times the families are new to us. They just found out about Project Cold Case, just started watching our Facebook Lives, or maybe this is their first one. And so we want to kind of every now and then go back and help them out and kind of catch them up to date on why we're here and what we do. So kind of bear with me if you've heard some of this stuff before. And I think we're having some internet problems. So give me a second on that, and let me try to switch over to a different router and see if that helps some. As I mentioned, we kind of started with some questions that were kind of basic and generic. When does a case considered cold? And honestly, that's different depending on which jurisdiction you're in, where you're at, and what agency your loved one's case is with, or the case that you're talking about. There really is no uniform definition of a cold case. It's mostly regarded as a case will be considered cold when all investigative leads have been exhausted. So when they've interviewed all the witnesses, when they've tested all the physical evidence that was left at the scene, that's kind of the benchmark for when a case is considered cold. And different agencies have different terms for a case that reaches that status. So it may be suspended, it may be inactive. Rarely will they ever use the term closed because there's no statute of limitations on murder. So they don't close the case, but there are times where they run out of things to talk about and run out of leads. So that's kind of, the generally accepted moment in a case's life where it's considered cold. So a lot of places, people ask us why we don't accept cases that have occurred within a year. and why our criteria is at least a year has passed. And that's really because it's not uncommon for a murder to take a year to make an arrest, even when it's not lingering, when there is plenty of evidence, when there is people to interview. Some people don't know this, but when the police arrest an individual, that's what starts the clock on a speedy trial. And by law, you only have 140 days or 170 days, whatever it is, from the time of an arrest to take that case to trial, unless the defendant waives speedy trial. And only the defendant can waive speedy trial. The prosecutor can't waive speedy trial. It's usually in the defendant's best interest to waive speedy trial, because that gives their defense attorney time to prepare for a murder case. But that's why sometimes that law enforcement has known that the person responsible in a case but hasn't made the arrest yet, and that can be very frustrating for families. But the reality is they need to make sure that they have all of their evidence, and that the state attorney and the prosecutor is actually, could go to trial within that short period of time, 3.5, 4 months that they have, even knowing that most of the time that case will get speedy trial will get waived and the trial will get delayed. Excuse me. But so that's, just one of the reasons why, sometimes when families ask us about our year criteria, that's just one of the reasons, is we feel like most law enforcement agencies, given a year, should know by that year point whether that investigation is leaning towards a resolution or is leaning towards being inactive or suspended. And usually by that year mark, you can pretty much tell, they can tell where an investigation is leading. And we like to at least give them that amount of time. And honestly, in some situations, a year isn't enough time. And we've seen many cases where it's taken, over a year, 2 years, 3 years before an arrest is made, even though law enforcement knew very early on in the investigation who the suspect was. It just took that long to figure it out. So that's kind of answers the question about, when is a case cold? It really depends on the jurisdiction, but you can pretty much figure that if there's not a lot of physical evidence, not a lot of witnesses, the community's not coming forward and helping, that a case is going to go cold pretty quickly. If there's a lot of evidence that needs to be tested, then that could be, it could take a lot longer. And in some states and some jurisdictions, the state crime labs are so overwhelmed that sending those pieces of evidence to them, a lot of times, they can only send so much evidence at a time, 3, 4, 5 pieces of evidence at a time. The lab will test all of that. If it comes back with something usable, then the investigation, follows that lead. If it doesn't come back with anything, then the detectives can send more evidence if they have it. And so you can see, and it takes a few months to get all that evidence processed, tested, and returned. So you can see how real quickly a case with a lot of physical evidence could take a while to get it all tested and returned back to law enforcement and lead to that arrest. So that's why we do a year. That's why, we try to tell families that are still within that year to not panic yet, that there's still a chance, that the investigation is leading to an arrest. Obviously the further along you get from that point, the more likely your case is going to end up, cold, inactive, or suspended. So, sorry, I see a bunch of people commenting. Shannon saying hello, Derek, Latrice, Emily, Faith, Phoebe, Yvette, Tamika. Thank you all for joining us today and tuning in. If you have questions, please post them in the comments section, and I'll try to answer them. You know, these cases, you know, sometimes in our office we forget things that you know are kind of the easy questions, you know, that we've heard the most, and we kind of take them for granted. And so sometimes we forget to go back and kind of you know, bring those back to the forefront and help out people that maybe are just starting to go through this, or are just starting to immerse themselves in things cold case related. So again, any questions that you have, post them in the comments. We'll try to answer them as best we can. Clint will try to answer them in the comments. You know, always use our website, projectcoldcase.org, as a resource. And you know, that could answer. There's a frequently asked questions page in there, and that may help. Yeah. So Derek just asked, wasn't aware about circumstances for speedy trials. Valuable to know. And it really is important to understand that we had a situation on one of the cases that we spotlighted a few months ago, a young victim down in Orlando, Florida, and they, you know, the case basically had to be dropped. And once, if you violate a defendant's right to a speedy trial, then you cannot retry that victim. You can't arrest them again. And so it literally means that if that gets messed up, if an arrest happens and the prosecution's not ready, and the defendant does not waive speedy trial, and he's not brought to trial in that time frame, then those charges, you know, will be dismissed by the judge, and they can't be brought against the defendant again. And unfortunately, we have seen that, and we've seen it in a few cases. It's really not that uncommon. It's a little less common now, but you know, we go back. We're looking at cold cases, and we have one just recently that was brought to our attention that's out in New Mexico, and a similar situation where there's information that an arrest was made, and then all of the court documents have been destroyed because it was so long ago and weren't available to figure out what happened after the arrest was made and what that suspect was actually arrested for. And now, you know, moving forward years later, the new district attorney and the new prosecutors are really concerned that they're not going to be able to make an arrest in that case, despite the fact that they know who the suspect is. So, you know, that's not, obviously not a situation we want to be in. And it's not a situation we want any of our families to be in. And it can sometimes be frustrating to know that the detectives know who it is, but haven't made that arrest yet. And that's usually the reason why. Julie asked a question too, I think. How common is genetic genealogy used to solve cold cases, and who would one contact about that? So thank you, Julie. This is a great question, a great opportunity. Genetic genealogy is being used more and more in cold cases, but not nearly regularly enough. And I'll explain that. What I mean by that is it's still an expensive technology to use, and it's still in its infancy. I mean, we're kind of in the first wave of technology that utilizes genetic genealogy. So the software companies, the genealogy companies, they're all in the process now of enhancing their software and their products and making them more effective. It's a lot like when they first started using DNA in forensics, you needed a lot of DNA, a whole lot of DNA. And now you need so much less DNA for a case. And genealogy is kind of the same way. Right now, it's still in that infancy of technology. It's a great, great tool, and the agencies that are utilizing it are finding a lot of success. Now, with all that said, like, you having a case that is eligible for genealogy is like the biggest hurdle to overcome. So think about it this way. Like, you have to have, I just told you don't need that much DNA for, for forensic technology now. But with genealogy, you have to have enough DNA that you can take from that whole amount that you have and specifically test this other amount for use with genealogy. And what I mean by that is they use different techniques to read the DNA. So it's not the same one that law enforcement uses and uploads to the National CODIS database. It's not the DNA that the state labs use to compare directly. It's a whole different kind of software and technology, and what's called SNP DNA testing. And then that's used for the genealogy purposes. And so you have to have that extra DNA. You can't use all of this DNA that you have that's evidence after you use the genealogy DNA. You still need to be able to come back and have DNA left over here that can be compared 1-to-1 to your suspect. And the best person to contact about it is the actual investigator on your loved one's case. And I know this sometimes is frustrating for people out there, but survivors are their loved one's best advocate. And while we have a lot of ins with law enforcement all over the country, we don't know every law enforcement officer, every detective, every agency, and they can oftentimes be very standoffish until they do get to know us. And while we can help facilitate that, and sometimes it's beneficial to have an organization like Project Cold Case reach out, the best way to do that would be to contact the detective on the case or the agency on the case and ask them a couple of simple questions. Like, one, is there DNA evidence, in the case? Because obviously without DNA evidence, then you can't do genealogy. So you find out if there's DNA evidence, you find out if there's a decent amount of DNA evidence that can be sent to private labs for testing. If you get through those barriers, then the question, of course, is, is that agency willing to utilize genealogy to assist in the resolution of a case? And honestly, right now, genealogy is kind of like the last step. Like most of these cases that we are seeing solved by genealogy, they would have never been solved without that technology, right? So, which is scary to think, but short of somebody walking in and confessing, those cases were not going to be solved. So it's a very, very powerful tool for those cases that are, that can use it. There's just not, you just have to call and find out each case very specifically, like which one, if that case is eligible, and then ask if they're willing. And if they're not, call us. Let's see if we can help, because we can sometimes assist in persuading them. We can sometimes assist with some of the finances. We have some connections with some genealogists and some private labs that offer, nonprofit discounts to us or a rate for Project Cold Case. We often say that there's a lot of reasons that a case can go cold. Finances should not be one of them. Money should not be one of them. So, if that's the response, that it's expensive, then let's talk and let's see if we can help with that. Let's see. I want to catch up here on another question. I don't know if this will all fit on the screen. Let me see here. Luann, let me see if I can. My husband's case is 38 years cold. We have a description of the vehicle the suspect left the scene in. Is there a database that would have the owners of this specific car in 1982? We don't have an exact year, late 60s, early 70s Nova. Let me see here, Nova or Yinko. Yinko was a knockoff version of the Nova. I realize this is a question that should be addressed to investigators, but we have not been successful in getting much cooperation when it comes to the vehicle. I have never heard of a database that has cars and definitely not cars with their owners. I think that law enforcement has access to to driver's license and cars that are registered to certain people. I don't know how far back that goes, quite honestly. And if so, it certainly gives you a starting point if you could find that. But I don't know that it would give you, there'd have to be a lot of other evidence. Obviously just owning a Nova in 1982 would not be enough. But if a certain person lived in the area, if a certain person had an issue with, your husband, if there's other corroborating evidence that puts that person that owned that car in that time, then that would help. But even then, remember, man, especially, an old Nova, like there may be pictures of that individual with that car. It's amazing how many people, put their old pictures on social media and show, what's old pictures with them in their car. So I wouldn't, give up on that. But I don't know of a database. I think, they could probably, investigators have ways of going back and finding out, old cars that people own. I don't know of anything public. And I don't know, again, with what other information there would need to be in order to corroborate that and make sure that that was accessible to that individual and puts them at the scene in that car. Tommy Stowe, thanks for joining us today. Derek wanted to ask another question about speedy trials. How does speedy trials work with cases where suspects have active arrest warrants and have not been located or apprehended? Is there a difference? Yes, as long as they haven't been physically arrested, that speedy trial doesn't start. That timer clock doesn't start. So those arrest warrants, they don't impact speedy trial. Although I'll tell you this too, Derek. Usually they're not going to issue an arrest warrant unless they feel confident that they have that enough evidence and that the state attorney's office is confident that they're ready to go. So it doesn't really impact speedy trial. Let's see. Sue, hi. Thank you for watching. You're welcome, Julie. Tanya, well, thank you. We appreciate that. Miss Jones, hey, it's good to see you on here. Hope you're doing well. That again, those are the questions that we like to answer or try to answer. If you have more of those, please, send them to us. I think next week I need to get on my phone and start texting some people and seeing if we can get some more guests on as we're starting to settle back into regular working conditions at our office. I think there was another question that came up or that I mentioned a second ago. Let me see here. I know what it was. Why do cases go cold? We have so many reasons why a case can go cold, whether it's a lack of evidence, whether it's a lack of, cooperation from witnesses, whether, lots of things can make a case more difficult if the remains are found after a period of time and decomposition has begun. That can make it a lot more difficult. If there's no ID of that body, that can make it more difficult. Elements of where that crime happened, if it was outside and it rained and, physical evidence was washed away, witnesses not coming forward, witnesses giving conflicting stories. There are a lot of reasons why those cases can go cold and remain cold. And so, it's not, we always wish that, that there was like one go-to answer that was easy explanation for why a case, has gone cold. And what we found is like there's so many reasons why. There can be bad detective work. It can be just an old case where they quite frankly didn't collect the evidence at that time like they would now, because they didn't know about DNA technology. They didn't know about genetic genealogy, even going back to, fingerprints. And so there's lots of reasons why, and it's important when you're thinking about a specific case that you think about why a case may have gone cold, and including, when did it happen? Was it an investigating agency that had experience with homicides? Is it a small police department? Is it a rural police department? Did they have help with the investigation? Was the investigator experienced? Lots and lots of questions like that, that we have to ask ourselves and kind of consider. Let me see what this question is from Tanya. What is the max a person can get for a child homicide if it's a cold case? It's been since 2003. I am Alexis Wright's mother. She was a cover case a few weeks ago. Yeah, Tanya, thanks for joining us. Yeah, we've had Alexis's picture on our site for a while now, and we did a spotlight on the case recently. We did a whole week worth of spotlights of children and minors that were cold case victims. And so again, your question is hard to answer, for a couple of reasons. One being, I think that happened in Alabama, so the laws are different in every state, and I'm not exactly sure what the laws are in Alabama. Also complicated in that case, and this because it took a while before the arrest was made, and it takes a while before arrests are made in child cases. And we've done a couple of spotlights and infographics and impacts on children that are that end up homicide victims and no one gets arrested. And I've been interviewed for stories from media outlets that they've done, because typically who the child is with, especially when they're young, and who the person was. It's not a who done it. Usually in these cases, I mean, if a child is abducted, then yes, obviously, but it's hard because it's a lot of times it's a story, right? So they typically don't call 911 and say, I was babysitting and the baby kept screaming and I shook the baby, or I hit the baby, or I dropped the baby, on purpose to get them to stop crying. Typically they say, the baby rolled off the couch. Typically they say, I tripped and fell on top of the baby. Typically they say, I turned my back for a second and the baby was choking and I was trying to save the baby. And you really don't have to, you don't, unless you have another witness, it's hard to prove those things. So baby cases are extremely difficult. Young children cases are extremely difficult. And it really depends on what the person is charged with. A lot of times we see baby cases where they're charged with manslaughter because they feel like that's the only thing they can get. And that's usually a 15-year maximum. It is in Florida, unless there's aggravators. If they're charged, obviously, with first-degree murder, it could be life. Some states have the death penalty. So it's, it really, really depends on what they're charged with and what they think they can get in trial. So, and let me see here, Sandra made a call, and Miss Jones here is an old co-advocate of mine. We used to work together, and she's got two grandsons basically that were murder victims. One is exactly the situation we just talked about, where he was a baby and the person in charge said that they tripped and fell and injured the baby, and it went to trial, and he was acquitted and walked out of the courtroom. And then Miss Jones' other grandson was murdered back in 2015, I think, Sandra, if that's right, and it's still unsolved as well. And she's been contacting detectives regularly, but with COVID, things have kind of been crazy. And by the way, if anybody watching, Clint just shared Alexis Wright's spotlight in the comments. You can go and see it. Hey, Allison, good to see you on here. Hey, Terry. Let me see. Julie had another, wanted to get back on genealogy for a second. We, as in family and law enforcement, are 90% sure of who murdered my cousin. Would that make the testing easier if you knew who to test right away? So the way genealogy works is typically you would only use genealogy if you had no idea who the suspect was. If you're 90% sure who the suspect is, what that agency probably should do is just a one-to-one comparison, which would be, I mean, if we're talking about Brandy's case, and assuming there is DNA, because we're talking about utilizing genealogy, what law enforcement will typically do is lawfully obtain a DNA sample from the suspect. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You knock on his door and ask him if he's willing to provide a sample, or they can follow him around until he spits on the ground, flicks out a cigarette, throws a cup away. They can, go through his trash and find his DNA and compare those one-to-one. So they would take his known DNA and then they would compare it to the one they had at the scene. And if it was a match, there's no need for genealogy, right? So they would be able to identify the suspect that way. Where genealogy really comes in is when you have no idea who the suspect is, and you use that DNA. You use a private lab to create a SNP profile. You run that profile through a public database like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. And then what that will do is it will provide you with other users who have publicly submitted their DNA to those websites, to the GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA. And then what a genealogist does is says, okay, I can tell because they have this much DNA in common, and there's a unit of measurement for that called a centimorgan. And they say, okay, if it's 3,000 centimorgans, it's a parent-child match. If it's 50 centimorgans, it's a third cousin or something like. Don't hold me to those numbers, but it's something around like that. But basically, the gist is, the larger the number, the closer they are in relation. So then you would take the known people that are the related, and you would say, okay, so this is probably a grandparent or a great grandparent or a sibling, and genealogists will build a family tree based off the known person, and they'll go back in time until they create a match that would then come forward in time and lead to the suspect. So genealogy is extremely time consuming because it's not just comparing the DNA. It's literally building family trees and genetic networks to figure out who a person is and who they're related to. So you take the person that and you follow them all the way back in time to a certain point where you start building back down and you identify an individual. And a lot of times, sometimes it is go see this person. This is the name. This is through the genealogy research that we've done. This is the person that we believe did it. But sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's this is the name, or these are the three people that I have narrowed it down to, or the four people that I've narrowed it down to, and then the investigator has to go back out and do that legally obtained, lawfully obtained DNA polls and either get a sample or not. But so, Julie, I know that was a really long-winded answer, and I hope I explained it in some kind of way that you could understand. Feel free to ask another question, but basically, to answer your question, if you're the best thing to do for the law enforcement would be to do a one-to-one comparison to the person that they believe is the suspect. And if it comes back a hit, then that's, there's your suspect and your resolution to the case. Hopefully, if it comes back that that's not him, and you really have an unknown DNA profile there, then that's where genealogy would really come into play. And Allison said, I'm still amazed the case was closed because the witness changed her story 3 times. Yeah, it's not, it's a case really needs a lot of evidence, a lot of whether it's circumstantial evidence or physical evidence. A case cannot be prosecuted on one person's story, and basically what you just described is why. Because if they take that case to trial and they put that witness on the stand and she says story number 2, and then the defense attorney says, well, you first you said story number 1, and then the prosecutor says, but then you said story number 3, all of that will come out in court. And then it's left to the jury to decide whether they believe her story number 1, story number 2, or story number 3. And what that actually does is it creates reasonable doubt, because there's 3 stories that they can pick from. So what law enforcement really needs is they need evidence that proves one of those stories. And if they can prove one of those stories with the physical evidence, then it's not as difficult to overcome some story changing. And it's really not uncommon for story changing for multiple reasons. Some people are involved and they don't want to get caught up in it. Some people don't want to get involved and they don't want to get caught up in it. Some people, a lot of times they have multiple witnesses give slightly variations of a story. And that's actually what investigators look for. If everybody has the same exact story down to the very last detail, you pretty well guarantee that they've been talking to each other. So perspectives are always just a little bit different, and trauma affects people in different ways. It's in a case like that, you have to have more than one person's story, especially if they're going to change it. Tanya comes back. We're bouncing around here a little bit, but I'm glad you guys are sticking with me and staying engaged. Capital murder is what is being sought. So capital murder, typically, I'll put that back up there. Capital murder typically would be at least a life sentence. In some states that do have the death penalty, they could seek the death penalty in a capital murder case. I would think that with capital murder being the charge in that case, that they have evidence that proves this was not an accident, that proves any of those kinds of stories we were mentioning before are physically not possible, and they're confident, because we see far too many children cases tried as charged with manslaughter, and that simply takes out that malicious intent to harm or kill, and gives the jurors basically a little sympathy if they think that, well, they probably didn't mean to hurt somebody, but they did. So let's see. Let me see here. My mom and aunt, let's see, Shalonda. My mom and aunt were murdered January 15th, 1988. My mom and aunt. Yeah. So, hopefully we have them on our site. If not, please go to projectcoldcase.org and submit them through the contact link. And make sure that goes for anybody. Yeah, Stephanie, go through his trash. That's right. That's when we're talking about, how to obtain somebody's DNA. And sometimes, like I said, you knock on the door and you ask them for it. If they've been interviewed a bunch of times, if they claim they want to help, they claim that they're not, they haven't, sought legal advice and haven't, invoked their rights, then sometimes they may be willing to submit it. Doubtful if they're guilty. And so when they're not willing to submit it, or if law enforcement doesn't want to tip them off that that they're looking at them and they're looking at that case, then a lot of times they'll go digging through the trash, like Stephanie just said. Let's see. Let's see what Tanya says here. When we do go to court with will all the detectives be called to testify? There have been multiple detectives on our case. In my experience, not necessarily, unless the defense wants to question them about something specific that was in the one detective's original report. But typically, the detectives will, kind of take ownership of the case. They will go back and confirm the things that are in the case from earlier on, and not just take somebody's word for it. So it doesn't necessarily mean they all will be. Although as frustrating as this is, and you're going to find out, when you go to trial, sometimes it becomes a chess match, and the defense is trying everything they can to muddy the waters and to complicate the case and confuse the jurors in an attempt to get that reasonable doubt stirred up. So if they think it will benefit them to call all the detectives, they might. The defense attorney might. The prosecutor most likely won't. Again, unless there's something the prosecutor needs on the record specifically from that original detective, then they'll usually go with the last detective, the one that made the arrest. The detectives stay on her case for a few years and then they either quit, transfer, something. So we have seen just an unbelievable amount of turnover with law enforcement, specifically with homicide and cold case detectives, since we started this organization. And it may very well be one of the most frustrating parts about what we do, because excuse me, once you finally get eyes on a case and they're finally looking at it and retesting evidence or re-interviewing witnesses, and then to get transferred or promoted or they retire or they quit, it's literally like starting over from scratch. And it's extremely, extremely frustrating. And we have not figured out a solution to that. But it is something that we share when we talk to sheriffs, we share when we talk to law enforcement, that it really is devastating to a family to finally, especially if you make a connection with a detective and you feel like they're communicating with you and they're doing good work, and then they leave and then you don't know what you're going to get, and you end up with somebody that's not as communicative and helpful. That can be very, very frustrating. Julie sees what we're saying and says it makes sense. Good. I'm glad I was able to explain that in some kind of cohesive manner. Let's see. Are crime labs allowed to throw away evidence on an unsolved case? It's been 35 years. So are they allowed to? I think there are some situations where if it's a private lab, I have heard of them after a year or 2 years or 5 years, they do throw it away if it's a private lab. Usually state labs are not going to throw anything away. If you're talking about, physical evidence at a lab, if you're talking about evidence that, clothing, a weapon, a watch, a pocketbook, something like that, that's in the evidence locker or the evidence room. There have been more stories than I could ever count about something getting thrown away. And typically what happens is those evidence units and buildings they're limited in the amount of space they have. We have all of these cold cases where all the evidence is still being stored. There are all these new cases where the evidence is being stored there. They literally have people that walk around there looking for evidence to throw away. Now, typically, the standard rule is you don't throw away evidence in a murder ever, because there's no statute of limitations on a murder. But if something got mislabeled or something got misplaced, or sometimes if a case is really old, like, usually it has to get to like the 50-year mark. If it's 50 years old, then sometimes they'll say, you know what, nobody from that case is alive. The suspect's not alive. The witnesses aren't alive. There's no way we could ever solve it. Evidence like that might get destroyed. Certainly don't condone it and wish there was another way, but I've heard of it. I've heard of evidence being thrown away, particularly if it's mislabeled. So we have a case where originally they thought it was an accidental drowning. That's how all the evidence was labeled and sent to the storage facility, to the evidence facility. While the autopsy was going on, an investigator found adhesive residue around the mouth and wrists of the victim, and called the detective and said, I think this is a murder. And the detective said, well, I've already told the family it was an accidental drowning. And the investigator said, no, medical examiner investigator said, no, this is a murder. And they never changed the way it was input in the box and the system. And that evidence 10 years later, when the family went to the sheriff's office to ask for an update and they went to go check it out, they realized that the evidence had been tossed. So yeah, I saw that you commented and said this was a murder. Again, typically they won't throw that away. They shouldn't throw that away. That should be a pretty easy policy with no statute of limitations. They shouldn't, in my opinion, shouldn't even be asking if they can purge evidence in an unsolved murder. So, but with that being said, it certainly has happened, and we've heard multiple, ways it can happen and multiple stories of how it happened. So, let's see. Let's go back to Tanya here. If you have done multiple lie detector tests, can that be entered into evidence, or all of them? Yeah, they're pretty much inadmissible, I think, in all courts. But again, sometimes remember when you're building your case against somebody, you want all of the evidence that you can get, and sometimes you can get something else from a lie detector that you're not going to bring in the results to the courtroom. But if you can figure out a way to use some of the information to perjure them on the stand in other ways, and obviously law enforcement thinks enough of them that they use them in most agencies, across the country. But unfortunately, the courts have determined that it is possible to deceive them, and that they can't be admissible in court. So let's see. When my sister's case got a new investigator, I wanted to meet with her, but I wouldn't until she read the case file. I think that's smart, Angel. I think I think it's important for families to keep in contact, even if you don't like the detective, even if you have differing opinions or views. I think it's important to try to find a balance there and a respect for each other, that we don't have to agree, but this is my loved one's case and it's your investigation, and we're going to have to deal with each other. So we need to find some common ground here. So I think it's important to keep in touch with those investigators. And when there's a new one, I think it's imperative that you meet with them. I think it's utmost importance to meet with them. And we had this conversation in our office today. Make an investigator look you in the eye and not tell you something, because it's a lot easier to not tell you something over the phone or in an email. But when a grieving sister or grieving mother is sitting across the table from an investigator, I find that more often than not, as long as you maintain that respectful, composure and conversation and relationship, that you will get something from an in-person meeting that you would not have gotten through a phone call or through an email. And I know not everybody lives in the jurisdiction where their loved one's case is, and I know it's intimidating to have those meetings, to go down to a police station, go through metal detectors, sitting up, basically a conference room that's more like an interrogation room. It's intimidating to sit there by yourself and then have 2 or 3 investigators all come and sit down across from you. we tried to, when we could, pre-COVID days, we would allow families to have those meetings in our office, and we had a good relationship with the local jurisdiction where they would come to our office. They agreed to come to our office, and so it wasn't necessarily neutral territory. It was almost more like it was the victim's territory, and so they felt a little more confident in those meetings. We've also used Zoom to set up meetings now with COVID and everything, and we've had meetings with families and law enforcement through our Zoom account. We can do that for anybody that wants that. We're willing to facilitate that as a service that we offer, of course, free of charge. So, but to the last point in your comment there, absolutely, you want them to read through that file first and have some information, because I've sat in meetings where they haven't read through the case file yet, and it's a lot of the victim talking or the survivor talking, and a lot of the detective going, yeah, well, I still haven't read the whole case file, or I need to go back through the case file, and that's not helpful to anybody. So I agree with what you did, and I think that that's an important thing for other families to remember as well. Make sure if you do set up a meeting that they have read the case file, are up to date on it, and have some information on it. It's just not going to be a very productive meeting if they haven't. I'm asking a lot of questions, but I need to understand everything, and I'm about to witness and hear when I go to trial. Yeah, Tanya, it might be good to call our office tomorrow or Friday and let us talk to you, one-on-one about some of this stuff, because we've sat through a number of trials. I mean, I can't count how many trials I've sat through, murder trials. It's really, really hard to prepare yourself for what you're going to witness and see. I would also recommend, and again, this is not a given, you're not guaranteed this, but call the prosecutor, call the state attorney, district attorney's office, ask them if they will meet with you prior to the trial, and ask them if they'll go through some of the evidence with you. Some of them won't. A lot of them will. And what I always would tell prosecutors is, you don't want the first time a mom sees the picture of their baby, on an autopsy table in a courtroom. You want her to have seen that in a safe environment, where if she's going to have an emotional outburst, she can have it in the safety of somebody's office or home, and not in a courtroom where if she has an outburst, there's a potential to prejudice the jury and to cause a mistrial. So I would always recommend that you ask. It's the right thing for them to do to have that moment with you and have that. And it takes, a couple hours. It's a long meeting, but and they don't have to go through everything with you. But if there's pictures that, so a lot of times what they'll say is, well, we want you to leave the courtroom. Well, you don't have to leave the courtroom. They want you to leave the courtroom in case you lose it. But that being said, we have a lot of survivors that say, I am not leaving that courtroom. And remember this, I always tell families, once it's up there, you can't unsee it. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. So have that conversation with yourself, pray about it, talk to your family about it, whatever you need to do to kind of recognize what is the best route for you. If it's best to step out of the courtroom, then do that. If it's best to stay in the courtroom but avert your eyes, do that. If it's best that if you are determined to see those pictures and be in that courtroom for every second, then I definitely recommend you make an appointment with the prosecutor ahead of time and go through those pictures so that it's not the first time you ever see them during the trial, because it's going to be shocking. It's going to be difficult. I'd also suggest that you have an advocate with you, whether it's the district attorney's office advocate, the state attorney's office advocate, the sheriff's office advocate, somebody in a organization in your area. It's helpful to have those things. Let's see. Karen, listening in again from Toledo, Ohio. Enjoy these live broadcasts. Very informative. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm glad that we can help share some of what we've learned over the years and what we experience, pretty much on a regular basis. Let's see. Shalonda said, my mom was 5 months pregnant and stabbed 96 times. Holy cow. Yeah, that is, I'm curious, in those cases, like, I don't know. I mean, and we've had this discussion before. When someone's pregnant, it depends on the jurisdiction whether they charge with that murder. In some jurisdictions, it has to be 9 months. Some jurisdiction, it has to be a viable baby that would have lived if it had been delivered, at that time. Obviously, we don't want to speculate, but you hear when somebody is stabbed that many times, that it's a crime of passion or somebody they knew. There's anger. So I wonder, I know here in Jacksonville that, like, the state attorney's office has been looking for stabbing cases because they feel like those close contact cases are a better chance to have transferred DNA from the suspect. And that's obviously a way to resolve a case. So, I would definitely check into that and make sure, see if they have DNA evidence and what they do. I won't leave no matter what I've dealt with. And I know a lot. Yeah, Tanya, I mean, you're kind of right there with, especially with most moms. There's a lot of them that just are like, I'm not leaving. There's nothing you can do or say. And it's not worth a fight or for the prosecutor because you have a right to be in there. So it's not really worth it for them to try to convince you otherwise. What they should do is try to mitigate some of that trauma that you will undoubtedly experience by meeting with you ahead of time. And I really can't recommend that enough. Allison says, I need my own TV show. I don't know about these TV shows. So believe me, I've had a lot of opportunities to speak with production companies over the last 5 years, and continue to. I just talked with one the other day, earlier this week. But if you can't tell, I'm more focused on these families and that they are taken care of. And unfortunately, a lot of these TV shows don't care as much about the family as they do about sensationalizing, a murder, the blood, the guts, the gore, and the advertising dollars that come. So if the opportunity ever presents itself where a show wants to, focus on what's important for those families, believe me, they know where to reach me. They call all the time. So Tanya said she'll call tomorrow. Yeah, please do call our office. And actually, tomorrow might be a bad day, but give us a call if not tomorrow, by Friday. Leave a message if you don't get us. We've got one of the things that we do is we partner with the University of North Florida here. They provide us with interns, and they provide us with journalism students to write the spotlights. And one of the ways that we reciprocate that is we provide, we do mock panel interviews for their criminal justice students. And both Frida and I will be doing that most of the day tomorrow. So if you don't get us, that's why, but we will certainly call you back. Shalonda says Sugar Creek, Missouri was where she was found. I think I saw earlier, Clint asked you if that one had been submitted. Please make sure that that these cases, we don't just look for cases and then pull them in and start spotlighting them. If you see a case on our website, it's because a family member gave it to us. A family member found us and wanted our help and asked us for help. Occasionally, law enforcement will do that too, and we will accept a case if law enforcement handles it. But we want to work with families that want our help, not that we're cold calling and asking to help them. So make sure for anybody that's watching that has a case that hasn't been submitted to us, let's make sure that you do reach out to us. Leslie and Bill said that their daughter Taylor was murdered in 2016. Autopsy was homicide by asphyxiation. She had DNA found under her fingernails and on her neck, but no murder charges have ever been filed. Only a misdemeanor for failure to report a death. There's more to this. PD has now called her case a cold case. Why would they do this? Thank you. So they would do that because, again, this goes back to, if you missed it earlier, you can go back and watch. So we talked about the speedy trial issue. So if they arrested somebody for misdemeanor failure to report a death, that means they didn't have enough evidence to prove that it was murder. Doesn't mean it wasn't a murder. It just means that at that time they did not have enough evidence to prove it in court. The fact that they charged them with failure to report a death does not impact that speedy trial at all. So it doesn't impact double jeopardy. So at any time, if they do have enough evidence, they can go back and charge that person with murder. Obviously, 2016, if there was DNA under the fingernails, they should have been able to recover that. It's not like it was a case before DNA. So it's hard to know exactly why, that case ended up the way it did. My guess, and I don't know how old Taylor was right out of the gate here, but a case going cold is devastating, but it's not the end of it. It certainly doesn't mean that that the case is never going to find resolution. What it means typically is that, unfortunately, that intersection of time and physical evidence and technology is not right. When they crossed in 2016, there wasn't enough there. So that's why we really, really encourage, raising awareness for cases, for sharing them on social media, sharing them on our website, because if there's anybody else out there that has information, somebody that maybe was told what happened to Taylor, witnessed what happened to Taylor, has any insight into what happened to Taylor in 2016, they may not have been willing and able to come forward. Maybe they were in a bad relationship. Maybe they had addiction issues. Maybe they were involved and concerned for their own safety. But that doesn't mean that one day that might not change. So it's important to keep that information out there and to, not give up on that. And I saw you just commented again. She was 22 and mother of twin girls. Oh, gosh. Yeah, you featured Taylor's case. We thank you for what you guys do. Yeah. I don't give up. We have seen time and time again where it's just not enough evidence in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, maybe 2020. Maybe for 5 years, maybe for 10 years, it's not enough evidence. But technology is constantly moving forward. What you have here is you mentioned that they are calling the case a cold case now, and if you can take away one positive from that, it means that there's no statute of limitations on murder, and it means that at any point, if new evidence or new technology comes up, they can utilize that to find a resolution and hopefully make an arrest in that case. What you don't want is what you saw Allison post earlier, where they close a case and they maybe make a determination that a case isn't a homicide or that it isn't a criminal act, that it may be justified homicide, because those are always much harder to change and to get opened back up. But if you have a case that they're considering cold, it means they're going to be willing to look at it again. And as technology improves and advances, and as maybe hopefully somebody gets their life together or gets out of that abusive relationship or that gets away from that addiction, maybe they would be willing to come forward with information, and I'm not saying that specifically about Taylor's case because I can't remember the details right off, but a lot of times, when there's these criminals don't keep quiet. They may say something, they may threaten somebody else and say, I've killed once, I'll kill again. And that kind of thing, when they get comfortable and think they've gotten away with it, then whoever they said that to, might be able to come back. I would assume that the sheriff's office, has, they have the person in their radar. They're just waiting for them to make that mistake. At least that's, what I hope. So never do anything to hinder the case. We've waited too long for justice. Absolutely. And prosecutors and detectives need to really understand that no survivor, no victim's family would ever purposely hinder their loved one's investigation. It goes against everything that we fight for. And it's a fun target word, and it's easy to say and it's catchy to say, well, I don't want to release that because I don't want to hinder the investigation, or I don't want to share that information with you because it could hinder the investigation. But the reality is it's the last thing families want to do, and it has happened, and it will happen again. But the reality is that if you build that relationship with investigators. And you have a mutual respect, and even better if you have a mutual trust, then you don't have to worry about that family ever saying or doing anything to jeopardize a case. And we try to share that when we have the opportunity to talk to law enforcement and advocates and prosecutors as well. Derek chimed in on the TV. Unfortunately, with TV shows, there's a limit on the cases can be covered. Not good for families. No, it's really, really not. It's I know a lot of families want their loved one's case on TV because you get all that exposure and kind of justifies, your love and how important that victim was. But a lot of times those TV shows are they're just out to make a buck. And if they hurt your feelings and trample on you a little bit, then they don't really seem to care. We did not have a visit from our friend Tammy tonight. She had commented on one of our posts earlier in the day, and I just commented 15 minutes before we started this live and told her to come on here and join us and ask the question here. But since she didn't come up, and I'm gonna have to wrap up here in a minute, she was asking about a new show out, and Julie, if you're still watching, it's called The Genetic Detective, and it's CeCe Moore from Parabon, and it's I think they've done 4 episodes now or 5 episodes now, and Tammy was asking me what I thought about it, and I've met CeCe Moore. I've talked to her in person. I've talked to her in email. We're friends on social media. And I love genealogy. I think it's an amazing tool that is really a game changer for cold cases, especially older ones that, have DNA evidence, obviously the ones that have DNA evidence, but that have been, submitted to CODIS. The DNA has been uploaded to CODIS and not had a match. It really changes the game for cases that really had no other options. And I love it. And she's been kind of the face of it, quite honestly. But there are some things about the show that I have not enjoyed. And I would just say, these investigations are a total team effort. There are so many people involved that no one can or should take credit for solving a case. There's obviously there's detectives, there's crime lab personnel, there's prosecutors, there's genealogists, there's a team of people working on that genealogy, there's a team of people in the homicide office or the cold case office that are all bouncing ideas and talking to each other. The reality of what goes into an investigation is a lot of work by a lot of people. And I think the show it's gotten a little better, but when it first started, it was really kind of painting a picture of, all you needed was one genealogist and 2 hours and you'd solve a 30-year-old case. And I think that's a little bit irresponsible. And I think that, that makes families think that something, that law enforcement is withholding a simple resolution to their case by not utilizing genealogy. And that's a really unfair painting of how that all works and how it happens. So that's one of the things that bothers me. I've also seen, this is my biggest pet peeve with television shows, is they don't utilize advocates to help out with the families. And these families get, blindsided with information, and no less with a camera in their face. And it's not fair, because then the camera crew goes home and the star of the show goes home, and the family is left to process that information, even if it's good, even if it is, hey, we've solved your loved one's case. And these shows should be more responsible, and they should utilize advocates to assist when they're interacting with family members, and not just victims' families. And one of the shows, they interviewed the suspect's daughter, and the suspect had committed suicide years earlier. And when they, asked the daughter how she felt, they kind of turned it and made it about them. And it just really, really bothered me. I just don't think that that's fair to the families or the victims. So, I hope all survivor families that have commented tonight get the justice they deserve. Thank you, Derek, and thank you for all your support and assistance in getting these stories out there, and recognizing the value that Project Cold Case provides to the community. It's, obviously we care about every single one of these families, but we also view cold cases as a public safety issue, because there's, that many bad people that have already done this before, wandering around our streets, capable of doing it again. And we think that that's a big issue. And so we're going to continue to fight for those families and for justice, and getting those bad guys off the street. Let me see what Tanya said here real quick. Yeah, you guys, I love to see when y'all, when you guys bond together and help each other out. It's great to see families come together and support each other. When my dad was murdered, it really was the support of people that had been through something similar that helped me in my grieving process, which is never ends. It still happens. I still grieve my dad. I still think about him every day. I still wonder if his case will ever get solved. But the way I was able to kind of, uncurl myself from the fetal position in the corner, which is what a lot of us, want to do from the moment we find out our loved one was murdered. The way I kind of got up and got back to work and started helping other people was really from other people helping me. So I love it when I see families connecting. Before I sign off, for those of you that are still on, and hey, Cheryl, you tuned in as we're I don't know if you tuned in. It says 1913 next to you. I don't know what that means, but if you're there, Cheryl, it's good to see you. For all of our survivors, we have a support meeting, a virtual support meeting tomorrow night. Don't be scared by the term support meeting. Tomorrow night, we're going to meet by Zoom at 6:00 from 6 to 8. We're going to have an opportunity to just kind of introduce ourselves if you want to, talk briefly about your loved one and who you lost, where and why. And then we're going to have a a therapist and counselor, join us about 7 o'clock. So we'll talk for that first hour and do our introductions and say hello to everybody. And then in that second hour, we'll have a counselor that will help us out on, I feel like a lot of people are really overwhelmed right now between the pandemic, the social unrest, the economy, politics, everything that's going on right now that we don't want to talk about on social media, but it's weighing heavy on us. And I've known just a lot of people just really feeling tired and exhausted. And so Lindsay is her name, and Lindsay is going to join us tomorrow, and she's going to kind of help us address some of those concerns about that overwhelming feeling and things that we can do on our own, in our own home, with our own space, to calm, relax, peaceful moments. And she'll be available to answer any questions that you might have as well. Again, free of charge. If that's something that interests you, call our office tomorrow. Email Frida at Frida, FREDA WP @projectcoldcase.org, and we'll shoot you out the link to that, to the support meeting. The email went out today, so if you were already on that list, you should have gotten the email today with the link to tomorrow's support meeting. If you didn't sign up for it, you can still do that, and we'll send it to you, and you can join us tomorrow night. Thanks everyone so much for joining tonight and having so many great questions. I hope it was helpful, and please tune in next week. If you're a survivor, join us tomorrow for our virtual support meeting. And as always, visit our website, projectcoldcase.org. And if we can be of any assistance, please call, reach out. We'll help however we can. Thanks a lot. Y'all have a great night.